Sega Genesis came out the same year, August 14th. Although it had been out for about a year in Japan.
Right.
But released over here on August 14th.
As the Mega Drive.
Yeah, that's interesting that like back then, consoles were named different things in different locations, in different regions of the world.
I personally like the Genesis name better, so I'm glad North America got that.
Yeah.
I remember that being, to me, it coming out a little bit before the SNES, and that to me is compared to the NES because we were in high school at the time. It just seemed like the cooler, sleeker. It was black, it looked like really slick. You saw the game's graphics were like really cool as compared to the NES. So that really captured me. I mean, I owned a Genesis, and Steve and I actually lived together in college, and we had the Genesis in the house.
It sat right next to the Nintendo. Like the Nintendo,
we played the Genesis.
It looked like a toy.
Yeah,
like it was less cool to have on your shelf.
Well, even the SNES, which was that gray and purple, right next to that black and red, and gray.
It just looked more dangerous.
Those controllers.
You guys brought girls home and you hide the NES
exactly.
Put the Genesis towards the front of the shelf.
I love the idea that you thought we brought girls home.
The controllers look like batarangs, you know?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, they were rounded, and then they introduced a third button.
The extra button. I mean, that was another thing that it had over the Nintendo system,
Now, I'll say that the Genesis, for me, the launch lineup was not fantastic. The pack-in game was Altered Beast, not that great of a pack-in game.
At the time, I didn't know. At the time, I thought it was awesome. I didn't know it was a really terrible game.
But later in the life cycle, I mean, there were so many games out for the Genesis. I think that's one of the things that made it so popular. Is that Genesis actually outsold SNES, over a span of about 4 years at Christmas time, because big part of that was because of the games library and because of the licensees that they had. And just how the graphics look. I mean, it just looked more advanced.
Well, they were pretty aggressive in their marketing, too, with the whole Genesis does what Nintendon't. I mean, they really went after their competition. And, like you said, dominated. Nintendo had owned that market for years. Yeah. And Sega came along and just started stealing it away from them.
And a couple years into it, Sonic the Hedgehog came out, and that was a huge breakout hit for Sega. Still really popular today with our readers.
Yeah, that would end up being the best-selling game for the system, although, of course, it was a pack-in game.
Yeah. Right.
This is actually Sega's third console. I didn't realize this. Before the Master System, in Japan, they had a system called the SG-1000, and there was a SG-1001 and an SG-1002.
Yeah, I didn't know that either, actually, until we were researching that a little bit, because I had a Master System as well, and the Master System didn't have that great of games. It wasn't that fun for me, but the Genesis was just a great system.
What a weird name for a consumer product, an SG-1000.
Well, not that weird for Japan.
Yeah, well, that's true, I guess. I just can't imagine anything coming out now.
SG stands for Sega Game.
Yeah. Not that weird, I'm sorry.
The Genesis would outsell the Super Nintendo 4 Christmases in a row. It had a lower price point and 10 times the games.
That's it, too. That's right, the lower price point as well. Now, kind of what I saw as the downfall of the Genesis is that they tried to keep putting on these crazy, weird add-ons that nobody, really wanted. Some of them were pretty inventive.
Sega CD,
I mean, they had
32X.
Exactly. They had some pretty inventive and innovative things that would become to be just kind of standard later in console development. But it did seem like you were just putting a lot more money into a system that was kind of old, and you're ready for the next system.
I remember though when we first brought back that multi-tap and were able to play 4-player games with things like General Chaos. I'm not even sure what year that was, if that was in the first year of it, but
no, General Chaos was a little bit later. Right. But speaking of multi-tap, games like NHL '94. Games like the BattleTech game that we played with, that was just 2-player, but that you could play. One person actually could work the guns and the other one the legs, and I was usually the legs, so I played the chicken legs.
It was like the most, it was the most ridiculous multiplayer concept where it's like, you guys are a giant robot, one of you walks and the other one shoots, and you're like...
It was a lot of fun, though.
That just makes sense. Oh, no, it was a fantastic
We totally
experience.
finished that game. But yeah, things like when we would get together and have all of our, our friends over, and you could play 4-player games, with each other on one screen, that was fantastic.
Yeah.
You talk about the sort of edgier vibe that the Genesis had. The increasingly violent games that were showing up on the Genesis at the time, Congress taking note of that is what eventually led to the ESRB. Games like Mortal Kombat on the Genesis, they didn't censor out the blood in the first game, and then on Night Trap on Sega CD.
Yeah, that was another thing. Nintendo and Mortal Kombat, you beat them up and green sweat flew off their body, right? That was another sort of...
NHL had the blood on the ice.
Yeah, it was another characterization of the way the two different systems handled content.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I just want to say, I think it was one thing for me too, is just being able to play having somebody, who we live together and being able to play multiplayer games with each other, like Pigskin is not a game that a whole lot of people know, but Pigskin Football, we used to play the heck out of that and waiting for the trolls to come out. If you don't know about it, it's this medieval football game where basically you can hang people, you can hit people in the face with a mace. If one person's losing really badly, you can get a troll on your team who's faster and stronger. So there were just these kind of like these weird concept games that were out on the Genesis too, and the library was so diverse. Road Rash was fantastic, motorcycle game. If you
but then like the standard stuff that people play all the time, like Mickey's Castle of Illusion or Gunstar Heroes. I mean, there were so many like games that were, be perfectly acceptable and accessible to people today that were just phenomenal in the system.
The animation on Mickey's Castle of Illusion was what totally blew me away.
Aladdin, both those are great.
I just remember like if you didn't touch the controller for a while,
idle animation,
the idle animation, and Mickey would just kind of sway back and forth with his hands behind his back and kind of start whistling, and I was just amazed. I was like, oh, that looks so good.
Yeah.
You also played Moonwalker.
Yes.
Michael Jackson's Moonwalker.
Yes, and the only reason it wasn't a great game, in all fairness, but I did love making dogs dance, and this is before the days of YouTube where you could watch that at any moment that you wanted to.
They were so far ahead of their time.
They were.
Back then. It's funny you mentioned Michael Jackson because when you mentioned tennis as one of the launch games earlier. Back in the day,
Game Boy.
Back in the day,
Michael Jackson's tennis?
They had to they wanted to attach people's names to these sports because it used to be you could just call a game baseball and it's our baseball game. We call it baseball. Like it doesn't work anymore.
Joe
but
Montana
that was
football.
that was the
Madden
standard
football.
back in the day. But Joe Montana football came out and
Buster
they
Douglas.
Buster Douglas boxing,
Mike Tyson,
and Michael Jackson's Moonwalker is exactly in that same category, right? Like they want to put that name recognition out there front and center, so people who maybe don't understand what this is all about at least recognize something.
It's almost a weird character from movies or something, right? Like you have to have a star attached, you have to have like a name on it. That's really interesting.
It worked out pretty well for Joe Montana football.
And for Madden.
The Master System didn't do so well against the NES, but the Genesis actually held up pretty well against the SNES. Like you said, it actually outsold it a few seasons. And I think overall, it sold about 40 million units throughout its lifetime. And I think as Super Nintendo was a little closer to 50, but super competitive.
Yeah, Nintendo was able to pull out in the end because of Donkey Kong Country. And at that time, they were able to add a new chip into the cartridges so it started to look a little bit more advanced than the Sega Genesis games.
I think that's one of the things about the Genesis. I talked a little bit about how I thought the games looked a little bit better. But games like Sonic, you go back to the original, and the first time you get hit and all your rings come out, your animation just slows down to nothing. Yeah. But I think we were a little more forgiving back then, too.
For sure.
I will say, I'm not very nostalgic for hardware. The Sega Genesis is a system I still own, and I just won't get rid of it. And I've got the games that I love on it. It's a hell of a thing hooking up to a TV these days. But
yeah, that's true. Would be remiss if I didn't mention Shining Force 1 and 2 were my favorite Sega Genesis games. Big turn-based strategy fan. And those games were awesome.
Phantasy Star games, too.
Oh, yeah.
On the Genesis, those were great.
SimCity was released in 1989. The original SimCity.
No wonder I almost failed college, right?
Well, that's actually what made me pass college.
Yeah.
I actually got a master's degree in urban planning because of SimCity. SimCity was the reason why I have my college degree.
You were like, I think I might want to do this for real.
Yeah. I was interested in the concepts behind the game. So it was something that I, don't do a whole lot about in high school, and played SimCity and saw that they had this urban planning degree at college. And I was like, let me take some of these classes. I liked it. And ended up getting a degree, which I'm using very well here at IGN.
Yeah, 10 years later, it's how invented Detroit.
It's funny that whole game is...
Well, I'm sorry.
The whole game is based on the question of, how do you get poor people to the library, right? And, that's your whole area of study, right? It's just kind of figuring out public transportation and where do you zone for certain things. And
concentric ring theory.
To me, that's what I love about
NIMBY.
it. I know they were pressured by, I guess it was Broderbund, to put in scenarios,
right?
So that there's actually something there's some scripted challenge. But I just love the open-ended toy box nature of it, the accessibility of it, and the fact that the game reflects your values, right? And that it's the same as that other big game that we played, which was Civilization, which is the reason I got a history degree. We did.
You guys were really easy to implement.
We did talk about this stuff a lot, but like that game, SimCity, is a game that asks.
Thank you, Will Wright and Sid Meier.
Yeah, that game asks you what it should be about. Right, whatever you want it to be about, the game accepts that and kind of feeds back to you a simulation.
And it's like
of
Minecraft
that.
today, right? It fed into the imagination of young people. It let you get absorbed and make what you wanted.
And you start telling stories. You're like, oh, this is the ghetto, and this is the slums, and there's a narrative that you build that you participate in. It's not just the game developer feeding you content.
Well, they're a lot more plentiful now, but there weren't that many sandbox games back in the day. And like you're saying, that is one of the ones that really allowed you to create something literally out of nothing. I mean, you had this blank slate of land, and then you can do whatever you want to do with it. You don't just have to delve into the world that somebody else built. You're building your own world, and you're making your own stories. And that was very interesting to me, because then I, really kind of saw the power of games as a device that's not just a start point and an end point, but it's something that can live for a long time.
Mm-hmm. There's a couple good stories about how Will Wright designed SimCity. His first game in 1984 was Raid on Bungling Bay, which is a game I'm familiar with but never actually played. I think it's a top-down military shoot 'em up. Yeah. And he found that he enjoyed creating maps for the game more than he was enjoying playing the game. So then he thought his next game should be about building these sorts of areas. And he was also inspired by a short story from the time called The Seventh Sally, in which an engineer encounters a deposed tyrant, and so he creates a miniature city with artificial citizens for the tyrant to oppress.
Yeah.
It's pretty good.
Yeah, he was also reading books on systems management and just kind of getting, I guess, really impressed with this notion of how a decision in one area can affect something somewhere else, which I thought was really interesting. And it teaches you about city planning, and it asks you questions about sort of your own political beliefs, like what do you value? Like, how do you feel about nuclear power? How do you feel about public transportation? Like, these are like relevant issues to society, but here confronted in a game, which is, I think, much more easy to digest.
As somebody with an urban planning degree, I can tell you that actually the game is pretty good.
Can we get that up on one of the screens back
Yeah,
here?
you just start every sentence
Just his
after that one.
diploma.
Yeah, this is the ticker at the bottom.
I can say that they actually do explore a lot of the concepts that you really talk about in those classes. So great job with that.
You actually wrote a paper on SimCity for your.
Well, I was going to do my thesis on SimCity 2000, but it got delayed and came out too late. But I was going to.
Oh, these developers don't think about the impact
I know,
that delay has on a person.
Actually, didn't get into SimCity until a couple years later. It was a launch game for the Super Nintendo, and that's where I actually played.
See, I played so much SimCity on Super Nintendo. Like, that's where I learned. And I remember those scenarios, all the weird, like, oh, a typhoon's going to hit the city or whatever.
Or the Godzilla that comes and wrecks the game on the PC or on the Mac. It's actually Bowser, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I believe so, yeah.
So they added like all these little Nintendo touches to it, which I think is super cute.
Yeah.